So guys, one of the most asked questions that we get on the channel is how to set up your suspension. So we at Next Level, we traveled all the way to Boise, Idaho to Carl Cycle Sales to talk with Jack Struthers, one of the legends of the sport. This guy knows suspension better than anybody. So we're gonna go inside and we're gonna find out how to set up your suspension. Let's do it. All right, Jack, good to see you again.
Good to see you. How you doing?
So Jack, tell everybody, I've been looking at the plaques, the Snowmobile Hall of Fame, everything out. Tell these guys a little bit about yourself, about Carl Cycle, and just give us a little bit of your background.
Okay, so Carl Cycle Sales, my dad started it in 1966, which is when I was like a year and a half old. And he started off selling motorcycles, Bridgestone motorcycles at the time. He became a snowmobile dealer in 68, and we sold snow jets. My first snowmobile that I rode was a snow jet. And then later on we got Polaris in 1982. And so we've been a Polaris dealer since 82. I've been racing since the 70s, and I had an 85 Indy. Well, I had 83 cross country, but then in 85, we put Fox shocks on in the fall of 84. So that was the first sled that we had that we were putting Fox shocks on. And I actually used that sled and raced with it and won the Rocky Mountain Circuit that year with Fox shocks on, in 84, 85.
That's
so
awesome.
That was the first year. That's when we got to start with Fox shocks and putting gas shocks or rebuildable shocks on snowmobiles. Before that, they had just like your basic steel, non-rebuildable shock. And so we started working on that. And because I was racing, we always wanted stuff to work better. And that's how we got into the shocks.
So fast forward all the way to today and today's technology, and like I said in the beginning, people reach out to me all the time when we were doing these videos, and we're always asking the public, hey, what do you want to see? What questions do you guys have? And this one is probably one of the most that we get, and that's setting up stock suspension. So you know what, Steven and I talked, we said, if we're gonna learn more about suspension, let's come to the guy that's been doing it obviously since the very beginning. So in terms of setting up a stock snowmobile, what's the first thing that like a guy just picks up his sled and he's excited about it, but he wants to know, what's the procedure? What does he go with? Where does he start and where does he finish?
So the good thing is now most sleds come with pretty good shocks. Polaris, has 3 different levels of shocks on their sleds. They come with the rebuildable Walker shock on it. ArcticFX, Skidoo, they all come with rebuildable shocks. Most manufacturers have rebuildable shocks on their sleds now that are, you can change the valving and stuff like that in them.
Right.
And they're good shocks to start with. So, for sure, this sled comes better with shocks than sleds in the 80s, for sure, by a long ways. I mean, they've come a long way. They have a lot better shocks stock than what they did. And, Polaris does a pretty good job of coming out with a basic setup for someone that's average size, the 180, 210 pound guy. They're set up reasonably well for that person. The spring rates are at least in the ballpark or close for it.
So
depending on individual
factory,
setup. From the factory, they're pretty close for the average size guy. Obviously, if you're really small, you weigh 110 pounds, you're gonna need to work on making it softer, going with softer springs and stuff like that. If you're a 300 pound dude, obviously you're gonna need to have stiffer springs to make it work and set up your sled. And people ride different. I mean, Polaris comes out with a generic setup that is good for what most people ride.
Good for everyone, right?
Yeah, and it's universal. And they do that, and they do a pretty good job at that, but there's things that you can do better for the way you want to ride your sled. We can start with on the front.
Yeah, let's do it.
Polaris comes with a 100-pound spring on the front, which actually works pretty well for this sled. It's a good setup, good starting point. Some people like their sled to be really tippy and tip over easy, so they probably need a little less preload on it. And so you basically control the preload on the spring is what controls the tippiness of the sled.
Okay.
Some people want it to be a little bit firmer and don't want it to tip as much. Some people want it to tip really easy, maybe more like a Skidoo handles.
Yep.
Like if you back the preload off on a Polaris, it'll act more like a Skidoo.
Okay.
Or, take the sway bar off, stuff like that will make it easier to tip back and forth.
Yeah, my next question was, Polaris aside, like with these other manufacturers, do you think that those setups from those snowmobiles come similar, where they basically just picked a preload, picked a shock setting that they feel like is kind of just for the masses?
Yeah.
So each one of them, right, as you get the sled, you don't have to ride it the way it is. You can make some tweaks to it.
Yeah, and I think every manufacturer tries to aim for what they think is the normal average guy and what they're doing. I think if you ride the different sleds, you'll find that manufacturer caters more towards one type of rider than the other one and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I think they try to hit what they think is the average mountain rider.
Okay.
And, you know, for sure people can take and change their setup and make it more for their liking.
Yeah.
You know, some people would like to ride it without the sway bar. Some people
Yeah.
like think it's way better the way it is stock.
Right, and you have ski
which is the
stands
way
to
I-
adjust as
yeah,
well. So a
you
lot
have
of
ski
things into the
stands.
front end that plays a role. When you talk about taking preload like in or out of a snowmobile, you want to just
So
show
we have a
people
preload.
like
We have a
what we're
preload
doing.
adjuster right here.
Okay.
And so you knock loose the jam nut. Then you can turn this up or down to control how much preload is on the spring. As it's better to have the weight off the sled when you do this, but if you crank that spring down, say 1/4 of an inch, it's definitely going to be more, you know, flatter and not tip as easy.
Okay.
So some people may want it to be a little more difficult to tip and be a little flatter on the corners on the trail. They might want to crank a little bit of preload in it.
Yeah.
Someone that, let's say that's a smaller person and they're having a little bit of trouble tipping up on the side, they might want to back the preload off a little
back
bit.
it out, certainly.
So, and realistically, you know, an 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch is going to make a pretty big adjustment difference that they'll feel.
Okay.
And they may like it the way it is stock, or they may like it backed off a little bit so it's a little bit easier to tip, or they may want it cranked down a little bit so it's a little harder to tip.
All right, so preload makes a big difference in how the snowmobile will handle, especially in the front, and especially to someone that, like you had said, you put somebody on here that's 110 pounds with the preload set the way it is, it may be pretty dang hard to move, so you might want to back that preload out.
Exactly.
Okay, well, perfect. Let's move on while we're on this sled. Let's talk about, okay, so if I came to you, Jack, and I know nothing about the snowmobile, I just bought it, I want to know, I'm 165 pounds, I want to know how you're going to set up my rear suspension, just a stock sled. Let's not talk about rider sag for a minute. Let's just talk about how you can make that experience in terms of setting up this sled make sense to me. So what's the first thing?
So there's 2 shocks in the suspension. The front track shock really controls how the sled handles and how it lifts. And what we find is if you have too much preload on that, your sled wheelies too easy.
Yeah.
And if you back the preload way off, then you don't get enough lift. So there's a setting there that's a good balance. If it's soft, it crawls up on the snow a little bit better, which is a good deal. If it's too soft, it can feel heavy in the front end and not lift and be hard to side hill.
Yeah.
So there's always a balance there of what you want. And at our store, we tend to set the front tracks preload back off a little bit because we think they get on the snow a little bit better and work in our wetter type snows a little bit better.
Right,
And
because snow condition
snow
plays a huge
condition
role
plays
as well.
a huge role in your preload setup.
Awesome. Yeah.
Someone that's got really dry snow, they can probably get away with a little bit stiffer spring because it doesn't really matter. It's going to crawl up no matter what.
It's going to crawl up no matter what.
And the wetter snow, it can trench and dig a hole, so they want to get it to crawl up. And what a person likes, how much wheelie they want. You know, if they wanted to lift the front end really easy, they might want more preload on their front track shock. If they want it to stay down, like a lot of the rimshot racers, they have literally no preload on their front track shock so they can keep the front end down on the hill.
Certainly.
Obviously, you have to be stronger and have more strength to tip it up and make it side hill, but it's more important for them to have control and be able to go where they want it to go.
And how much would the limiter strap play a role in terms of keeping the front end down? Would they be also cranking into that limiter strap?
Yeah, the limiter strap does control it, and if, you know, Polaris makes the limiter strap one length stock, you'd have to drill the holes to move it. But for sure, people like Race and Rimshaw will tighten the limiter up to keep the front end down on the hill. Some people, like if you put a turbo on it, we'll get people that want to do that because they're hard to control and they want to wheelie over backwards. So they might tighten the front limiter strap up. The drawback to tighten the limiter strap is you lose travel. Your suspension doesn't ride as good in the bumps. But if you're willing to sacrifice that to gain control and be able to turn it where you want it to go, that's the way that works.
Okay.
The average rider that's riding in the mountains will probably leave the limiter strap pretty close to where it is or not really have to worry about it. But they can, you know, play with their preload up and down, and if it's lifting too much, they'll back the preload off a little bit, and that seems to work pretty good.
Awesome. So we've got the front shocks. We're understanding
Key
what
shocks,
those differences
control the
are.
front end tip.
Now we've got the center shock.
That
We're talking
controls
about
how much it lifts
how
a
much
lot.
forward and aft, and now we've got the rear track shock. So explain to me what this rear track shock does and what I'm supposed to be feeling. So you and I are very similar in body type and weight at 165, 170 pounds. What's the way that it's set up stock, and what should you look for as like that first ride? Like what should we be feeling?
So I think, you know, the average manufacturer probably looks for 180 to 210 pound riders. They're target.
He's just taking it as an average, okay.
And I would say the stock RMK comes with a 210 pound spring, which works pretty good for a 180 pound guy, 200 pound guy. It works. It's a pretty good rate for that. And basically that rear spring controls the weight of the rider. And if you're a 300 pound rider, obviously you need a stiffer spring than a 110 pound rider. And if you're 110 pounds, you're going to want a softer spring like the 185 pound spring that comes on the Chaos or something like that.
Right.
If you're 300 pounds, you're going to want a bigger spring. If you're 240, 250, we make a spring that's a 230 pound spring that would work for that guy. And or someone that's racing rim shot might want that to keep the front end down. The rear shock does have an effect on how much it lifts or doesn't lift. You can crank in some preload on the rear and make it not lift as much, but then you sacrifice some ride quality too.
Okay.
So like you might set your stock spring up at 10 5/8 and that rides really well, but then you get on a hill or you have a turbo on it and it's lifting too much, you might want to crank that spring up to 10.5 inches of preload. So the spring is shorter, has more tension on it, will keep it from lifting as much.
Yeah.
Maybe you want it to lift a lot so it's easy to side hill. Maybe you want to back it off to 10 3/4 so you have a little bit more lift.
Yep.
And you can probably do that with just preload adjustment on the stock spring. Like someone like your weight, you could definitely get by with the stock spring.
Yeah.
And just adjust the preload up and down. If you're 110 pounds, you'd want a softer spring, and then you could have the same range.
Perfect. And then in what situation, we're talking about springs only at this point, in what situation, being that 110 or 300 plus pound rider, are we going to recommend actually going inside the shock and actually changing what that shock is?
So we do revalve a lot of shocks here, and we feel we have a better valving setup than stock for most people. And what we find is if you're riding, say you're riding really slow, you just put down the trail and you don't ride very hard, you don't push it hard on the trail, you might want a softer valving setup. Someone that's racing rim shot needs a lot stiffer setup, or someone that really rides aggressive and pounds the bumps would want a stiffer valving setup. So even though they're a 170 pound guy and they'd have the same spring as you and I, if they're really beating the bumps hard, they would want to valve their shock a little stiffer so it absorbs the bumps and doesn't bottom out all the time. If someone weighed our same weight and they were just putting down the trail really slow, they might want to valve the shock a little softer so it's a little cushier ride, and that would be more to their liking.
I got it. So I can tell when I stare at a spring and I understand spring rate in terms of what's the rate of that as I'm collapsing that spring. How does valving work? So when you say I'm going to, stiffen up the valving, what's happening internally to the shock that's actually making that shock better for that heavier rider, or better even for that lighter rider? What is it doing?
Okay, so the shock has oil in it, and it has nitrogen. The nitrogen's there to keep the oil from fading as it gets hot. So the oil does all the work, and there's valving washers that go in and out through the oil and control how fast it bottoms out. Basically, if the valving is stiffer, you have to push more oil through that valve, and it's harder to push it through, so it's stiffer. So it keeps the shock from bottoming out. So if you had no valving in the shock, it would just be the spring rate. It would bottom pretty easy. You put the valving in it to make it stiffer so it's harder to bottom, or you have compression valving, which controls how fast it bottoms. Then you have rebound dampening, which controls how fast it comes out. So if you put a 250 pound spring on it, you need to put more rebound in the shock to control that spring.
That's right.
If you weigh 110 pounds and you put a 180 pound spring on it, then you have to take some rebound out so it returns fast enough to work. So a softer spring needs less rebound, a stiffer spring needs more rebound. The rebound is there to control the spring. The compression dampening is there to control how fast it bottoms out. And if you're riding really aggressive, you obviously need stiffer compression dampening to keep it from bottoming. If you ride really slow and want a cushy ride, or if you just want to ride as a cushy ride, you might want to take some valving out of it and make the compression dampening a little softer.
Man, a lot of information, Jack, and it's really helpful. I think to finish this up, like really what I think ultimately what I want to know about all of these things is, you're a great source. Not everybody has you as a source where they can, reach out and have someone explain to them really what they're supposed to be feeling while they're on the snowmobile, especially if they're a first-time rider. So ideally, when you're going to go out for that first ride, what you're saying is it really is all about, sort of your own input to the sled. Like if you do want to just ride slow and you want that cushy ride, the stock setup, the way the sled came, you could easily get pretty complacent that like, wow, this is just as good as it gets. or you can watch this video, start to understand that you can make a ton of changes to make that sled work for you, right? You'd agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. And we do a lot of revalving. We have our own valving setups that we use for people that we like. And if you call us up and say, hey, I weigh 110 pounds and I want this, we can valve it and set up for that. If you're 300 pounds, and we can set you up with the spring and the valving that should work great for you. And we try to ask how they're riding, what they're doing, if they're pounding the bumps hard or if they're just play riding in the mountains and stuff like that. We can custom valve the shocks for them and set them up. And then a lot of it's understanding what it does and play with some spring adjustments yourself or whatever.
And is there any measurements that anybody can make? I know we wanted to stray away from actually setting the sag because of just how complicated it would be, especially on like a showroom floor. But is there any measurements that a guy can make to the front end of the snowmobile? Is there any technical info like that?
So if you send your shocks to us and we set them up, we give you measurements of starting points for preload.
Yes.
So like on a ski shock, we'll set the spring up at 10 1/4 inches long. The front track shock happens to be at 8 3/4 inches long, or the rear shock's at 10 5/8. That's where my springs are set on my sled, and so if we were setting them up for me, that's the way they would come out of our shop set up for you.
Yeah.
And then if you want something special or different, we would discuss that with you. Or if you were 150 pounds, you'd have a little less spring preload on it when it left our store.
Yeah.
And that's the way we'd start off with some measurements of the spring measurements. That's the easy way to do it.
Yeah.
And then if you tip your sled over on the side and you measure it and it's 10 5/8 and you ride it and you go, man, I'm wheeling too much. You could crank that spring down until it's 10 1/2 inches long and you'd have less wheeling. You might like it better. Or you might put that 10 1/2 in there and go, man, I like the way it doesn't wheelie as much, but I hate the way it rides. I want to go back to 10 5/8. You go back to 10 5/8. Or you go, oh, I went the wrong way. I want it to be softer, and you could back it off a little bit.
Okay.
But if you take a measurement, you know where to start. You can always go back to there.
So kind of the key to somebody's success is to literally, write this stuff down. Take these measurements and then make these small changes. Like you were saying earlier in our conversation, like a 1/4 inch. Like if we're adjusting preload in or out, that a 1/4 inch actually makes a big difference.
Yeah, or even an 1/8 inch. Like
Right.
on the rear shock, an
Yeah.
1/8 inch is quite a bit. Even one turn, which is less than that, makes a difference.
Okay.
And maybe to start with, you go in 1/8 inch increments, but then you might go a half turn or a turn later on if you get to fine tuning.
Okay. And we've been talking a lot about valving and coils and everything else for the air shock guy that's out there. Similar theory apply in terms of how front track, rear track, center shock, like what does it all look like for the air shock guy?
Yeah, so the air shock guys, they have basically what they do is they use air pressure instead of the spring. That shock has the exact same valving setup as like these shocks do. The only difference is they have an outer sleeve that has air in it, and that outer sleeve has, controls the spring. So instead of having, like on a ski shock, instead of having a 100-pound spring here, you would have 110 pounds of air in it and a separate eval chamber that has 160.
160, something like that.
And you might have something like that would be a similar rate to a 100-pound regular spring.
Yeah.
And if you want a 200-pound spring, it's really nice with air because you can just put more air in it.
Right.
And you get 150 pounds in it, it's going to act like a 200-pound spring.
All right, Jack. Well, I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah,
Tons of
thank you.
information. Last question to you. Many of us, so many of us, myself included, I think that we ride with that level of complacency where we've been riding on the sled, we've put 500-700 miles, pretty hard miles, we've been out there just ripping it up. At what point do I service my shocks?
Well, the ideal setup is to get a new sled every year and you don't have to worry about it, right?
He knows me too well. That's it. Perfect.
So the oil in your shock is doing all the work. And as you go through bumps, every time you hit a bump, the oil is doing work in the shock. And so the oil does wear out and deteriorate. And also with the cold, as it heats and cools, it tends to suck in a little bit of moisture. I would recommend you get your oil changed once a year because it does get some contaminants in the oil from the oil doing the work and also from water. Now, we use a really good oil, a high viscosity index oil. We like to use the oil that's made for snowmobiles because they tend to be better at dealing with water ingestion and stuff like that. So we'd use like a Fox or a Walker oil that's made for water ingestion and stuff like that. There's other oils out there that are designed for dirt bikes that might be a good oil for not fading, but they don't deal with the water as well. The Walker and Fox oils are good because they have a high viscosity index and they're made to deal with water a little bit. So I would recommend once a year you'd want to change your oil.
Yeah, that makes
because
total
that
sense.
shock's doing a lot of work every time you're riding. It's working.
Yeah.
And so it does deteriorate, and I would recommend doing it once a year.
So a guy goes out, he buys a sled, saw it on some site and bought it. It's got X amount of miles on it. Is it probably a good idea first of the year for him to pull those shocks off and have them rebuilt? He doesn't know who wrote it. He's just seeing the miles.
Yeah,
it's probably a good idea to
it's
start the
probably
year.
a good idea. Yeah,
right. So
start
as
off
part of
fresh.
our preseason maintenance, we're going through the sled. We're looking at belts. We're looking at track. We're looking at we're looking for all those things. But having your suspension serviced is a really big great start to the season.
Yeah, and it just keeps parts from wearing out and keeps your sled working good. And if you get up in the morning, you've got a lot of water in your shock, it's going to be super stiff and not act right.
Awesome. Well, tons of info. Well, here it is, guys. Hopefully that answered a lot of questions. I know I've gone to school. This man knows, I think, more than most about suspension tuning, shock setup. I think we could go on and on, Jack, about all this stuff. It's pretty infinite. Anyway, we really appreciate it, you guys. Remember to leave those questions and comments. We're going to put a special plug about Carl Cycle and all your help here. You guys have been absolutely awesome to me over the years. So you'll see that in the description below. Reach out to Jack and his team of professionals here for all those shock setup and all that information. And if you want to get your shocks rebuilt, this would be the place to go. So leave those questions and comments below, and we'll see you next time.